I'll be back by Thanksgiving, don't worry, Danielle reassured Stacy, forcing a smile as he zipped up his suitcase. He glanced at her, but she wasn't looking at him. Instead, her gaze was fixed on her phone, her fingers tapping away on the screen. It's just a couple of days. Stacy finally looked up, her expression unreadable. I know, just make sure you get that deal. You know how important it is. Her voice was light, but there was an edge to it that Danielle couldn't ignore. He nodded, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at him. Yeah, it's important, he repeated, though his mind was elsewhere. As he walked to the door, he turned back one last time, hoping for some sign of affection, a smile, a kiss, anything. But Stacy was already back to her phone, her face illuminated by the screen. He swallowed the lump in his throat and left. The drive to the airport was quiet, the usual excitement of a trip replaced by a nagging feeling that something was wrong. He tried to push it aside, focusing instead on the upcoming meetings in New York. But even as he boarded the plane, that unsettling feeling lingered. In New York, Danielle threw himself into work, hoping it would distract him. The meetings were intense, and his colleagues were in high spirits as they prepared for the holiday. But Danielle's thoughts kept drifting back home. The way Stacy had been acting lately, distant, distracted, wasn't something he could ignore. He had chalked it up to stress, but now, miles away from her, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. On the third night, after a successful day of meetings, Danielle was in his hotel room when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his boss. Great job, Danielle. We're ahead of schedule. You can head back home tomorrow if you want. Danielle's heart leaped. Thanks. I'll do that, he replied quickly. The thought of surprising Stacy and spending Thanksgiving together lifted his spirits. He could see it now, her face lighting up when he walked through the door, the two of them laughing over a glass of wine. Maybe they could talk, really talk, and figure out what was going on. The next morning, Danielle caught the earliest flight back. As the plane descended into his hometown, his anticipation grew. He pictured Stacy's surprise, the joy in her eyes when she saw him. He imagined the warmth of the family gathering, the smell of turkey roasting, the clatter of dishes as everyone prepared for the feast. But as he drove towards her parents' house, where Thanksgiving dinner was being held, his excitement gave way to unease. He had tried calling Stacy from the airport, but it had gone straight to voicemail. The same thing happened with his texts, no response. He told himself she was just busy helping her mother, but the knot in his stomach tightened. Danielle pulled into the driveway, noticing the cars lined up outside. The house was alive with the sounds of laughter and conversation. He smiled to himself, imagining how Stacy would react when she saw him. He stepped out of the car and walked to the front door, pausing for a moment to take it all in. Then, quietly, he let himself in. The warmth of the living room enveloped him, the familiar faces of family and friends filling the space. Danielle looked around, searching for Stacy. And then he saw her. She was across the room, sitting in the lap of a man he didn't recognize. Danielle's heart stopped. The man's hand was boldly sliding up under her dress, his fingers tracing the inside between of her thighs. Stacy's head was tilted back, her eyes half closed, a faint smile playing on her lips. The sight of her like that, so comfortable, so intimate with another man, made Danielle's blood run cold. He stood there frozen, his mind racing to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. How could this be real? How could Stacy, his wife, be doing this? He wanted to look away, to erase the image from his mind, but he couldn't. The world around him seemed to fade, leaving only the scene in front of him, Stacy with another man, her body responding to his touch in a way that Danielle hadn't seen in years. Stacy? His voice came out low, almost a growl, full of a cold fury he hadn't known he was capable of. Stacy's eyes snapped open, and she jerked away from the man as if she had been burned. Danielle? She gasped, scrambling to her feet, her face flushing with a mix of shock and guilt. What are you doing here? Danielle didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the man, who was now smirking at him, unbothered by the situation. The man leaned back casually, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. His arms stayed draped across the back of the chair, his fingers brushing against Stacy's back as she stood there, trembling. I finished early, Danielle said finally, his voice icy. Thought I'd come home for Thanksgiving. This isn't what it looks like, Stacy stammered, her hands shaking as she tried to straighten her dress. Danielle's eyes narrowed. Really, bitch? Because it looks pretty clear to me. He took a step closer, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The man let out a low chuckle, as if this was all a joke. Well, this is awkward, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. You caught us, what now? Danielle ignored him, his focus entirely on Stacy. How long? He demanded, his voice hard. How long has this fuck been going on? Stacy opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her eyes darting between Danielle and the man beside her. I asked you a question, bitch, Danielle growled, taking another step forward. A few months, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's not what you think, not what I think. Danielle's voice rose, his anger boiling over. You're sitting on another man's lap, his hand up your dress, and you say it's not what I think? Danielle slapped across her face. The room had gone silent, the festive atmosphere evaporating as everyone turned to watch the unfolding scene. Danielle felt something inside him snap. The betrayal, the humiliation, the months of doubt and confusion, all of it surged to the surface. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Leonard and Linda were in the kitchen, arranging the final touches for the Thanksgiving feast when the noise from the living room caught their attention. Leonard's brow furrowed, sensing the tension. He set down the carving knife and exchanged a quick glance with Linda before stepping into the living room. As he entered, his face brightened with a forced cheerfulness. Danielle, you made it, Leonard exclaimed, his voice betraying a note of unease. Stacy's parents known, and they had done nothing to stop it. Danielle, who was still seething from the sight of Stacy with the neighbor, turned his gaze towards Leonard. The man who had once been a pillar of integrity in his eyes now looked like a coward, a man who had not only known about the affair but had allowed it to continue under his own roof. The respect Danielle had once held for Leonard disintegrated. Did you know? Danielle's voice was low, his words dripping with accusation. Leonard's smile faltered, and he glanced nervously at Stacy, who stood motionless, her face pale. He cleared his throat, attempting to diffuse the situation. Danielle, let's not make a scene, all right? It's Thanksgiving and we should… Did you know? Danielle repeated, his voice rising with each syllable. His eyes locked onto Leonard's with a fury that made the older man take a step back. Leonard hesitated, his gaze flickering between Danielle and Stacy. Danielle, it's not what it looks like, he began, his voice shaky, but the weak denial only fueled Danielle's anger. Not what it looks like, Danielle echoed, his voice dangerously calm. Because it looks to me like my wife. Your daughter has been screwing your neighbor, and you're perfectly fine with it. Linda, hearing the commotion, appeared in the doorway, clutching a dish towel as though it were a lifeline. Her face was a mixture of shock and fear as she took in the scene. Danielle, please, she said, her voice trembling. We can talk about this later, after dinner. There's no need to. After dinner? Danielle's laugh was harsh and bitter, a sound that sent shivers down Linda's spine. You want me to sit down and share a meal with you, knowing full well what you've been hiding from me. Stacy took a tentative step towards Danielle, her eyes pleading, but there was a desperation in her movements that only deepened Danielle's disgust. Danielle, I can explain, she began, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. Explain what, Stacy? Danielle cut her off, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. Explain how long you've been lying to me? How long you've been humiliating me behind my back? Tears welled up in Stacy's eyes, and her hands trembled as she reached out towards Danielle, but he recoiled as if her touch would burn him. The pain in his eyes was evident, but there was no longer any love in his voice, only a cold finality. Danielle, please, don't do this, Stacy whispered, her voice barely audible as she tried to close the distance between them. Danielle stepped back, his voice hardening with every word. You don't get to ask me for anything anymore, Stacy. The words hung in the air, heavy with the finality of a door being slammed shut. The room fell into a suffocating silence, the festive cheer drained from the air. The tension was palpable, with everyone waiting for what would happen next. Finally, the neighbor, who had remained seated through most of the exchange, stood up. He adjusted his shirt with a casual air, brushing off the tension as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Danielle, buddy, let's all just calm down," the man said, his tone condescending and infuriatingly relaxed. "It's not the end of the world." Danielle's eyes narrowed into slits as he stared down the man who had destroyed his marriage. "You think this is a joke?" Danielle asked, his voice low and deadly. "You think you can walk into my life, wreck my marriage, and walk away without consequences?" The man shrugged, his smirk never leaving his face. "Look, I get it. You're upset. But Stacy and we have something special. You should have seen this coming." The arrogance, the sheer audacity of the man's words, was the last straw. Danielle's vision blurred with rage, and before anyone could react, he lunged forward, his fist flying towards the man's smug face. The impact was brutal. The sound of Danielle's knuckles connecting with the man's jaw echoed through the room. The neighbor staggered back, crashing into the dining table, sending dishes and glasses crashing to the floor. "Danielle, stop!" Stacy screamed, rushing forward, but it was as if she were moving in slow motion, her cries lost in the fury that had overtaken Danielle. Years of suppressed anger, betrayal, and humiliation poured out of Danielle in a violent torrent. He grabbed the man by the collar, lifting him off his feet, his fists raining down blow after blow. The neighbor tried to shield himself, but Danielle's fury was unrelenting. Stacy's parents stood frozen, too shocked to intervene, their eyes wide with horror as they watched Danielle unleash his rage. The room that had once been filled with warmth and laughter was now a battlefield, with Danielle determined to destroy the man who had ruined everything. Finally, Leonard snapped out of his stupor and rushed forward, grabbing Danielle's arm. "Danielle, enough!" he shouted, pulling him back. "You'll kill him." Danielle shook Leonard off, his chest heaving as he glared down at the man now lying on the floor, bloodied and barely conscious. "That's the least he deserves," Danielle spat, his voice trembling with emotion. The room was in shambles, the Thanksgiving dinner destroyed, but Danielle didn't care. He looked around at the wreckage, at Stacy, who was now sobbing uncontrollably, at Linda, who was staring at him in shock, and at Leonard, who was holding him back with trembling hands. The life he had known, the future he had envisioned, all of it had been ripped away. Chaos erupted the moment Danielle walked out. Stacy's lover, his face bloodied and swollen, staggered to his feet. His previous arrogance had been replaced with sheer panic. He glanced around wildly, realizing the gravity of what had just happened. Leonard tried to step between them, his hands up in a placating gesture, but Danielle wasn't in the mood for any more interference. "Get out," Danielle growled, his voice trembling with rage that barely contained itself. "Get out of my sight, all of you." The neighbor didn't hesitate. He bolted for the door, his once confident demeanor shattered. In his desperation, he nearly tripped over the threshold, fumbling with the doorknob before yanking the door open and disappearing into the night. "Wait, please," Stacy cried, her voice thick with tears as she ran after him. "Don't leave like this." But her pleas were met with silence as he fled, not sparing her a single backward glance. Linda gripped Leonard's arm tightly, her face ashen as she watched the scene unfold. "Danielle, please," she began, her voice wavering. "Let's just talk. We can fix this somehow." "Fix this?" Danielle interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "There's nothing left to fix. You all betrayed me. You stood by and watched while your daughter destroyed our marriage, and you did nothing." Leonard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He knew Danielle was right. There was no excuse, no justification that could undo the damage that had been done. The truth of their betrayal hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Stacy returned, her face streaked with tears, eyes swollen and red. She looked at Danielle, her voice trembling as she tried to find the right words. "Danielle, I'm so sorry," she whispered, I never wanted it to get this far. I didn't mean, but it did. Danielle cut her off, his voice cold and unyielding. And now you all have to live with the consequences. He didn't wait for a response. Danielle turned on his heel and strode toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence of the room. With a final glance back, he saw the wreckage of what had once been his life. Stacy, crumpled and broken. Linda and Leonard, standing helplessly as their world crumbled around them. The door slammed behind him with a resounding crash, the sound reverberating through the house like a death knell. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of the moment sinking in as the reality of their actions settled over them. They all stood frozen, the realization of what they had lost sinking in. Outside, the night was quiet, the chaos of moments before now replaced with an eerie stillness. Inside, the remnants of a broken family stood in stunned silence, each one knowing that things would never be the same again. Danielle didn't go home. The idea of stepping back into the house where he had built his life with Stacy now felt like a twisted joke. Instead, he drove with no destination in mind, the storm of anger and betrayal tearing through him. He wasn't sure how long he had been driving when he finally stopped outside a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. It was nothing like the comfort of his home, but that was exactly what he needed: distance, a break from everything familiar. The motel room was as bleak as he felt. He sat on the edge of the creaky bed, his head in his hands. The adrenaline that had driven him through the confrontation had drained away, leaving behind a crushing emptiness. His mind replayed the events, each detail a fresh stab of pain. He had lost everything: his wife, his home, the future he thought he had. But in that emptiness, something else began to stir. As Danielle stared at the dingy carpet beneath his feet, a new resolve took shape. He wasn't going to just walk away, defeated and broken. No, they had all conspired to humiliate him, to tear his life apart, and they would all pay for it. Danielle made a silent vow. Stacy, her lover, her parents, none of them would escape the fallout. They had betrayed him, and he would make sure they felt his pain 100-fold. The next morning, Danielle woke with a singular clarity. The rage that had consumed him the night before had hardened into a cold determination. This wasn't going to be a spontaneous outburst of anger. It was going to be a meticulously planned execution of justice. He called his boss, feigning illness, and secured the time he needed to set his plan in motion. Danielle began by gathering information. He knew Patrick, the wealthy neighbor who had been involved with Stacy, had a lot at stake. Patrick's reputation in the community was built on wealth, status, and an air of untouchable arrogance. Danielle was certain that beneath that polished exterior, there were secrets, dark, damaging secrets, that could destroy him. Patrick's arrogance, the very thing that had allowed him to seduce Stacy, would be his undoing. Danielle spent the next few days digging into Patrick's life. He accessed public records, scoured real estate holdings, and searched through financial documents. He also called in a favor from an old friend who worked as a private investigator. The friend owed Danielle, and within days, he handed over a dossier that painted a damning portrait of Patrick. Shady business deals, offshore accounts, and connections to unsavory characters who wouldn't hesitate to turn on him if it meant saving themselves. With this information in hand, Danielle felt the first taste of satisfaction. But this was just the beginning. His next move was more personal. He hired a locksmith to change all the locks on his house, making it clear that Stacy was no longer welcome. Then, he sent her a brief, emotionless message. "Your things are on the porch. Don't come back." He knew this would catch her off guard, leaving her scrambling for a way back in. But Danielle was done with her lies and manipulations. He had no interest in hearing her excuses or apologies. The silence would be his weapon, unsettling her more than any confrontation ever could. While Stacy was dealing with the harsh reality of her situation, Danielle turned his attention to her parents. He knew they had been complicit in her affair, and they were just as guilty in his eyes. But he needed them to believe that he was ready to reconcile, to work things out, and to move forward. He called them, his voice measured and calm. "I've had time to think," he said, masking the coldness he felt inside. "Maybe we can work something out. Let's meet for lunch." Leonard and Linda were eager to accept. They were desperate to mend the rift, to return to the comfortable life they had enjoyed before Danielle's unexpected return on Thanksgiving. They saw Danielle's invitation as a chance to smooth things over, to convince him to let bygones be bygones. But Danielle had no intention of making amends. As he set up the lunch meeting, he was already planning how he would use it to further his goal. Leonard and Linda had betrayed him, just like their daughter, and they would face the consequences. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be far too late to undo the damage. Danielle's trap was set, and now it was just a matter of watching them walk right into it. The lunch meeting was held at an upscale restaurant, the type of place where deals are made and anniversaries celebrated. Leonard and Linda arrived early, their expressions a mix of anxiety and hope. They had spent the days since Thanksgiving trying to reach Danielle, desperate to repair the damage that had been done. When Danielle finally agreed to meet, they saw it as a chance to mend fences, to return to some semblance of normalcy. When Danielle walked in, he was all smiles, radiating the calm of a man ready to forgive. "Hey, Mom and Dad," he greeted them warmly as he sat down. "I appreciate you meeting me here." Linda exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Danielle, we're so relieved you agreed to talk," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "This has all been such a terrible misunderstanding. Stacy, she's been beside herself since that night." Danielle kept his smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure she has," he said, cutting her off gently. "But that's not why I wanted to meet today. I think we need to discuss the future. Specifically, the future of your arrangement with Patrick." The color drained from Leonard's face. He tried to hide his reaction, but his hand shook slightly as he picked up his water glass. "What are you talking about?" he asked, struggling to maintain his composure. Danielle chuckled, leaning forward slightly. "Oh, come on, Leonard. We both know Patrick's been more than just a neighbor. I've done my homework. I'm guessing there's been some financial incentives involved? Maybe a few deals under the table?" Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "Danielle, that's absurd," she protested, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her. Danielle's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. He lowered his voice to a whisper, forcing them to lean in closer. "I have everything I need to destroy Patrick, and if I do that, your little gravy train dries up. But I'm willing to make a deal." Leonard's hand trembled visibly now as he set his glass back on the table. "What do you want, Danielle?" he asked, his voice cracking under the pressure. "It's simple," Danielle replied, his tone icy and direct. "You and Linda cut Stacy off financially. No more support, no more cushy living arrangements. She's on her own from now on. And in return, I keep Patrick's secrets buried. No one has to know about the shady deals or the offshore accounts." Linda looked at Danielle with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "You can't do that, Danielle. She's your wife, for God's sake." Danielle's eyes hardened, his voice taking on a steely edge. "She was my wife. Now, she's just a slut who used me and betrayed me. This is the deal. Take it or leave it. But if you refuse, I promise you'll lose a lot more than just Stacy's lifestyle. You'll lose everything." Leonard and Linda exchanged a desperate glance, realizing they were cornered. They had no choice but to comply. After a tense silence, Leonard nodded slowly, defeat evident in his posture. "All right, Danielle. We'll do it." Danielle nodded, satisfied. "Good. I'll be in touch with the details. Enjoy the rest of your lunch." He stood up and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Leonard and Linda in stunned silence, the reality of their situation sinking in. The storm was just beginning, and Danielle was ready to unleash it. With Leonard and Linda sidelined, Danielle focused his efforts on dismantling Patrick's life. The dossier he had painstakingly compiled was a weapon, but it wasn't enough to simply hand it over to the authorities. Danielle wanted Patrick to suffer, to watch as everything he had worked for was slowly torn apart. Danielle began by anonymously leaking snippets of the dossier to local journalists. He started small, just enough to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those around Patrick. Rumors began circulating about financial discrepancies and questionable business practices. It was nothing concrete, just whispers that hinted at something rotten beneath Patrick's polished exterior. But in the business world, whispers could be more dangerous than facts. At first, Patrick dismissed the rumors, confident that his reputation could withstand the gossip. But as days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder and the stories more detailed. Journalists started digging deeper, finding connections and inconsistencies that hadn't been there before. Patrick's business partners began to get cold feet, pulling out of deals or renegotiating terms to protect themselves. The pressure was building, and for the first time, Patrick realized he was in trouble. Meanwhile, Stacy's life was falling apart. With her parents cutting off their financial support, she was left to fend for herself. She tried desperately to reach out to Danielle, hoping for some kind of reconciliation, but every message, every call went unanswered. Danielle had blocked her on every platform, leaving her isolated and adrift. As Patrick became more consumed with his crumbling empire, he had less time and patience for Stacy, who quickly realized that her affair had cost her far more than she'd anticipated. Danielle watched it all unfold from a distance, satisfied but not yet finished. He knew that Patrick's downfall wouldn't be complete until he was financially ruined. To achieve this, Danielle set up a meeting with one of Patrick's biggest competitors, a shrewd and ruthless businesswoman named Elaine. Armed with the most damaging information from the dossier, Danielle offered Elaine a deal that was impossible to refuse. "I know you've been looking for an edge over Patrick," Danielle began, sliding a thick folder across the table toward her. "This is everything you need to dismantle his remaining assets. Use it wisely, and you can take over his market share without lifting a finger. In return, I want a cut of the profits. Enough to make this worthwhile for both of us." Elaine flipped through the folder, her eyes widening as she absorbed the information. "This is explosive," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "He won't know what hit him." "That's the idea," Danielle replied, his voice cold and detached. "Just make sure he's left with nothing." Elaine didn't need convincing. Within weeks, she used the intel Danielle provided to systematically dismantle Patrick's business. Deals fell through, clients jumped ship, and lawsuits began piling up. By the time the dust settled, Patrick was bankrupt, his life's work reduced to ashes. He was left with nothing, no money, no influence, no allies. The dust had settled, leaving behind a landscape of ruin. Danielle stood amidst the remnants of the life he once knew. His emotions were oddly neutral. There was no regret, no guilt. Each action had been deliberate, a calculated response to the betrayals he had endured. He had returned the favor, and the scales had been balanced. As for Stacy, she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, realizing too late that the price of her betrayal was more than she could ever repay. Danielle, having exacted his revenge, finally felt a sense of closure. The storm he had unleashed had done its work, leaving only wreckage in its wake. Stacy, once so vibrant and assured, was now a shell of her former self. Stripped of her financial support and social standing, she had fallen from grace. Danielle heard through various sources that she had fled town, unable to bear the shame of her actions. Whispers of her downfall spread quickly, and the life she had taken for granted was now a distant memory. Patrick's fate was equally grim. The once powerful businessman had vanished, leaving behind a mess of lawsuits and broken contracts. Danielle had ensured that Patrick's reputation was thoroughly destroyed. The community, once dazzled by Patrick's wealth and influence, now turned its back on him. His competitors, armed with the information Danielle had provided, eagerly seized the opportunity to drive him further into obscurity. Leonard and Linda faced their own reckoning. Without the financial cushion they had relied on, they were forced to downsize and adjust to a far more modest lifestyle. The opulent home they once enjoyed was sold, and they moved into a small, unremarkable house. Their standing in the community deteriorated rapidly. The once respected figures were now subjects of gossip, their complicity in the scandal evident to all. They were shunned, their every step followed by the whispers of their past mistakes. Danielle's final act of closure was to sell the house he had shared with Stacy. The sale was swift, and he used the proceeds to start anew. He relocated to a new city, far from the memories and betrayals of his old life. The new environment offered anonymity and the promise of a fresh start. Danielle wasn't sure what the future held, but he was resolute. The control he had fought so hard to regain was his, and he was determined to protect it. In his new city, Danielle focused on rebuilding. He found a modest apartment and began to settle into a routine that was devoid of the turmoil he had left behind. Each step he took was measured, each decision calculated. He engaged in new projects and opportunities, deliberately keeping his personal life private. The betrayal he had faced had taught him a harsh lesson, and he intended to use it to his advantage. Danielle's new beginning was not marked by grand gestures, but by a quiet, determined resolve. He had taken back control from those who had wronged him, and he was committed to ensuring that his life would never be subjected to such betrayal again. The past was behind him, and the future was a blank slate, ready for him to shape on his own terms. #Epilogue. The price of revenge. Danielle sat on the balcony of his new apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand. The city lights stretched out before him, twinkling in the distance. It was a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed his life just weeks ago. He had won, but the victory was bittersweet. The revenge he had sought and achieved had been satisfying in many ways. Patrick's empire lay in ruins, Stacy had been left to grapple with her own choices, and Leonard and Linda were forced to confront their own downfall. Yet, despite the satisfaction, Danielle felt hollow. The cost of his actions was evident, not just in the lives he had disrupted, but in his own sense of self. He took a long sip of his drink, the burn of the whiskey a sharp reminder of the path he had chosen. The alcohol was a welcome distraction from the whirl of thoughts racing through his mind. Danielle wasn't naive. He understood the gravity of what he had done. He had orchestrated a series of events that had left deep scars on many lives, including his own. The man he had become in the process was unrecognizable from the person he once was. Danielle's thoughts drifted to Stacy. He remembered the love they had shared, the hopes and dreams they had once talked about. Was there ever a point where things could have been different? Could they have reconciled, healed the rifts? The questions lingered, but the answers were elusive. The choices had been made, and the consequences were now irrevocable. He considered what the future might hold. There were no guarantees, no clear paths laid out before him. He was starting over, but the slate was far from clean. The weight of his decisions pressed heavily on him, and he was left to navigate the aftermath on his own. Yet, amid the uncertainty, Danielle found a strange sense of peace. The freedom he had fought so hard for was his at last. It was a freedom from the betrayal, from the deceit that had marred his life. As he stared out into the night, Danielle felt the first stirrings of hope. He took another sip of his whiskey, the warmth spreading through him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. The price of revenge had been steep, but with it came a newfound freedom. And with that freedom, Danielle was prepared to start anew, this time on his own terms.